If you've been told that adding cardio will kill your gains, today's episode is about to prove otherwise. The conventional wisdom says you can't build muscle and train for endurance at the same time. The fitness industry has convinced millions of lifters that cardio is the enemy of muscle. But what if the research and real-world evidence shows that that's completely wrong? My guest today performed one of the most compelling experiments in fitness history, transforming from competitive bodybuilder to Ironman finisher in just 6 months while maintaining his physique. You'll discover why you can hold on to and build muscle as a hybrid athlete and learn the exact framework for building strength and endurance simultaneously. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Pape, and today we're going to answer the question, can you build and preserve muscle while training for endurance? My guest today is Kris Gethin, a drug-free pro bodybuilder who has also competed as an Ironman triathlete, ultramarathon runner, Spartan competitor. At 50 years old, he's publicly documented his physique through multiple transformations between competitive bodybuilding and extreme endurance events. As the former editor-in-chief of bodybuilding.com and co-founder of Unmatched, Kris Gethin Gyms and Kris Gethin Coaching, plus his huge online following, he's impacted millions. And the reason I invited him on Wits and Weights is because of his evidence-informed approach to hybrid training and his willingness to test and experiment with his own body. Today, you're going to learn why cardio doesn't kill your gains, how to structure training when you want both muscle and endurance adaptations, and strategies that allow lifters of any age to build resilience without losing their physique. Kris, thanks so much for coming on. Welcome to Wits and Weights.
Thank you very much for having me on. Really appreciate it, Philip.
So let's get right into the heart of the topic here, right? Most people think you have to pick a lane, strength and muscle or endurance type sports, cardio. And a lot of the lifters I hear from, the older guys, they're often worried about doing too much cardio, especially in terms of their recovery, their adaptation. So what's the reality when it comes to how our body can handle these different types of modalities and even doing them at the same time?
Yeah, so good question. I've come from more of a sporting background, as a lot of people that got into bodybuilding have. I was into a lot of extreme sports, motocross, downhill mountain biking, and I had to do a lot of cardio for that. And I was one of these people that at the time when I was doing the cardio, I didn't really enjoy it so much because I was dealing with chronic asthma. I had croup as a child, almost died. And asthma was just something that I just couldn't get on top of. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s and I've just started bodybuilding at this time that I was able to eliminate myself of asthma. And I was on Seretide, Becotide, Ventolin, all these different drugs to try to stay on top of the asthma. And, I removed a lot of gluten from my diet, the traditional dairy. I obviously had an allergen and inflammatory response to these things. And I think because now I was actually transitioning into bodybuilding, I'm starting to study nutrition. I went to college to study international health and sports therapy. I'm actually looking at what I'm putting into my body. So when I was actually able to get rid of the asthma, the cardio that I was doing, I'm actually starting to enjoy now. Where it was such a task before, it was a challenge. And now it was kind of a blessing. I really, really enjoyed it because now I can actually see the improvements and I can feel more comfortable out there as opposed to struggle and hating it, not because of the cardio itself, but because of the asthma. So then when I actually started doing a little bit more cardio with the weight training, I found my ability to recover was much faster. Now, I wasn't doing extensive amount of cardio. I wasn't going on 8-mile runs or anything like that. But that cardio was definitely carrying oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to the localized areas of what I was training. So, for instance, if I trained back, I trained legs, chest, whatever it may be, now the blood flow is taking those nutrients that I'm consuming to those localized areas. So I found I was able to hit those muscle groups with more frequency, more ferocity, and my ability to recover. And I always say your recovery kind of dictates your performance. My performance was improving in doing so. So it's always kind of been a part of my bodybuilding heritage. And then I think it was in 2016, I was really toying with the idea because I'd retired from natural bodybuilding in 2009, I was doing these kind of various video trainers that was, I was publishing on bodybuilding.com. So they were daily video trainers. People would follow me getting ripped or follow me putting on size. And I thought, well, what else could I do? I thought, well, I love cardio. Maybe I'll do a performance-based one. Maybe I'll do a marathon or something like that. But then I liked cycling. I do a lot of mountain biking. I liked running. Perfect. I suck at swimming, but I knew that that would be something that wouldn't have a compound effect on my joints. It would actually alleviate my joints and allow my cardiovascular engine to still transition into my run and into my cycle. So I thought, well, maybe we should give a triathlon a go, and maybe that could be the next video trainers. And, when I started talking to people about that, people said, oh, you're going to suck at that. And I had that mentality, well, if I'm going to suck at it, sign me up. Let's see what can be done and if it can be achieved. And you know what it's like when somebody, first does, was it like the break a record in something, whether it be a deadlift, whether it be a marathon time or whatever, then all of a sudden, other people start breaking that record. It's like you've blown off the impossibility or that lower ceiling that people live under. And then all of a sudden, other people are able to achieve it. So that's what I was kind of hoping that would be done if I was able to achieve this goal of doing an Ironman in a space of 6 months, a full Ironman, then other people would follow. And that's exactly what happened. So then that's where I started kind of teaching other people who are bigger, because I'm about 214 pounds now. I was about 220 pounds doing the Ironmans and the other endurance sports, just to show people, like you so rightfully said, you don't have to give one up for the other. Because a lot of people got into bodybuilding from a cardiovascular sport, maybe triathlon or maybe running or whatever it is, but they gave it up knowing that they were stepping into the bodybuilding world. But now they had the opportunity to do both. And since then, a lot of people have come up to me at expos with their medals, whether it be for, a half marathon or an Ironman, and said, I was able to achieve this now because I didn't believe that I could before. So, what I'd set out to do, I definitely accomplished in that world. But, and we can talk about this in the show, it comes with several caveats. When you're trying to maintain and build muscle, being a bigger person, that you have to think about in regards to your training, recovery, and frequency of the training.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that in a second. But a lot of what you said, I personally can relate to. And I know folks listening have gone through that journey of, either they were in sport at one point or cardiovascular activity. Like for me, it was CrossFit for like 8 years, and then got into lifting. And I thought, okay, this is completely different. So of course, one doesn't follow from the other or blend with the other. But then I started doing obstacle course races. I'm like, man, this strength is really helping, but so is the conditioning. And I could see the beauty of putting them together from a fitness perspective, which is, I think, a really good word here. Sometimes that word's overused, but in this case, it makes a lot of sense. And you also talked about the benefits we can gain from cardio for things like blood flow. Even just you walking on your treadmill right now, right, has a big positive impact on health. And people who sit all day for desk jobs, who's a lot of my clients right there, busy people, just getting up occasionally even has a big impact. So, you said you hated swimming and then took the challenge. I love that attitude, because that's where I think a lot of people can lean into the thing they don't really like as the thing they need to improve, and can see a big step change, right? So when we look at then the misinformation about concurrent training or about this interference effect, where did that come from? Because I've only been in the industry like 5 years, and it was starting to turn around then. But at one point, it was a big deal to say like, okay, cardio is going to kill your gains. Let's understand where that comes from, and then the rest will make sense.
Yeah, so I think it just came from the old age. You'd see bodybuilders basically eating and sleeping. You think of a baby's always sleeping, and they're growing because now they're, basically hibernating and allowing the nutrients that they're consuming to grow the muscle. And the more that they move, the more that they're going to expend. And you reserve that time and energy and a calorific surplus for your workouts. And that is it. But I think we've transitioned more now into a health-orientated society where, okay, maybe that did feed the bodybuilder, but now we want to feed our health span. And you see it in supermarkets. Like, when we were younger, there was no Whole Foods, there was no co-ops. And now you see in your general supermarket store more protein fortified foods. Some of them maybe not so good, but we're going in that direction. And I think that's where it's come from. And obviously CrossFit was a big proponent of this, because you'd see a lot of those pro athletes looking like bodybuilders, built, jacked, but they can swim, they can walk on their hands, they can do clean and jerks, they can run, they can do all sorts. And I think a lot of it came from that as well, that hybrid athleticism. And what I feel, and this is what I've tried to, tell people, is that you shouldn't be a static ornament. I have a desk job, but I'm always moving. But if not everybody is going to have a treadmill desk, I get that. But I'll ask people, every 30 minutes, maybe do some squats on your chair. And maybe if you're embarrassed because you're in front of other coworkers, do some toilet squats. Just some sort of movement every 30 minutes or so. I'll always do that when I'm on a plane. I travel a lot. I'm not going to be there on a 16-hour flight the entire time and just staying still. No, I'm going to move, and I think it's very important that we focus on the most important muscle that there is. And it's not the pecs, it's the delts, it's the heart. That is what it's going to carry us into our adventurous years past retirement. And then, of course, the brain, the organ that requires blood flow. And you know what it's like when you move in the morning, all of a sudden you can think clearer. You have more cognitive function if you're eating well. So the importance of cardio in both of those realms, I think, have come to a little bit more of a forefront, especially with the inclusion of biohacking now. Since over the past, say, 15 years, people are understanding, okay, we do need squat strength. We do need grip strength. We need that bone density and muscle density to be more metabolically active, have stable blood sugar levels. But we also need to have good VO2 max. We've got to have that cardiovascular function. It's not just one thing. We know that the blue zones where people live to a disproportionate age, centenarians around the world, yes, they have connection with family. They don't really train in CrossFit boxes or the gyms, but it's not just this one thing. It's the movement, it's the feeling of belonging, it's purpose. It's all of these things combined. But we know the heart and the brain is a big proportion of that, and bone density and balance. Because if they look at the bone density of people, for instance, in Sardinia, where they have a big proportion of people that are living to centenarians, they have perfect bone density. Same if you go to Okinawa. Now, there's people in Okinawa may not be squatting in a gym, but you see these people over 100 years old standing and sitting from the floor about 40 times a day. That's their resistance training, and they've got great balance. And of course, they may be eating a little bit different to what we do in a westernized world. So I think we're learning a lot of these things, and we're including them into that lifestyle, whether we're an endurance athlete, bodybuilder, CrossFitter, whatever it is. It's just having that subconscious voice that's telling us, okay, we got to do something a little bit different, further than what I was taught when I was a kid, looking up to Arnold Schwarzenegger or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. So the hook of this episode was hybrid athleticism, but really I think we're talking about that being the desire of anybody who wants to be healthier, live a long time, have cognitive health, everything you just said. I think there's confusion as to what is the purpose of cardio? And even the word cardio has become kind of a bad word for some people. And really what you're talking about is using your body for your everyday movement patterns and what it was designed for, right? Whether you're doing it to a more intense, ferocious level, like you mentioned with slinging around iron, or it's just a natural part of your lifestyle, which in the Western world, for many of us, if you're not lifting weights, you're practically not doing anything probably beyond that. So why don't we create a spectrum here and start with, okay, people who are listening here, they know the value of lifting weights. Now they want to become more active and move toward that hybrid approach. And then after that, we can say, okay, what about more extreme? Like if you want to do endurance events or competition. So maybe let's start with the general, what's next for somebody who's lifting weights and maybe walking, but not much else.
Sure. Now, I'd always look at the lifestyle first. If I've got a client come to me and they want to participate in endurance events, but they want to work out or whatever, be a hybrid athletes, I'll look at their lifestyle. What is their ability to recover? Have they got 4 kids and they're taking some different sporting events? They got a very stressful but sedentary job. They're not able to sleep much. Well, that tells me that they're probably going to be in a more sympathetic dominant state. Their ability to recover is going to be lessened. So I'm going to give them probably less to do, because if they're not recovering, they're not going to perform. And, we could possibly see a decline in their testosterone, their heart rate variability, and it's not going to be good for them. So always look at those things first, their ability to recover, and that will dictate a lot of things from there. And then we have that transition in. So let's say, we were talking about swimming, being that weakness, focus on that challenge. So I'll always say, let's focus on turning your weaknesses into your weapons. Why can't you swim? Because if anybody comes to me and says, hey, I want to do a triathlon, 9 times out of 10, they'll always say, but I suck at swimming. I can't swim. It's everybody. It's the majority of people. So that's what we're going to focus the majority of our time doing. The frequency is going to be there. Now, it isn't so much difficult. It's not difficult on the joints. If anybody's listening here, you'll know it all comes down not so much even to fitness. It just comes down to technique. So once you've actually got that technique down, okay, then we can work on speed. And I like to do that with everything. If we're talking about running, which the majority of people are, the majority of injuries from, if you have a comparison model of people that work out with weights, strength trained athletes, and then endurance athletes, there are much more injuries that are prevalent with endurance athletes, specifically running, because of that constant repetitive nature. And it's not something that kind of pulls and snaps straight away. It's over time, and we ignore it. We're in denial of it until it's too late. So we'll always focus on that technique specific to that person, making sure that they've got the right footwear. I love Hokas, like the Cliftons or the Bondis, and the Hokas are perfect for me, my structure and my size. I've got very skinny ankles. My feet avert a little bit, so they're perfect for my gait and my run. That technique could be making sure that your eyes are as smooth as possible on the eye line. They're not jumping up too much. So we're trying to use our posterior chain, our glutes and our hamstrings. If that person has access to like a Woodway or like a curved treadmill, where you see a lot of the CrossFitters use, they're going to work their posterior chain much more, activate your glutes, activate your hamstrings. Perfect. Okay, now we've got that technique down. Now we start working on building up the time, the speed, the frequency, and alternating that with the workouts. So to begin with, the workouts are generally, the weight training workouts are generally on a non-cardio day to begin with, okay? So we alternate between the two. As we get a little bit better, and I can see that person's HRV is good, their ability to recover is good, now we start combining them both on the same days. Because what I like to do, and not everybody would agree with this, I like to pre-fatigue. So let's say I go to the gym and I train legs. As soon as I finish my leg workout, now I'm going for my run, because I want to get used to getting my technique down and allow myself to be prepared to run on tired legs. Because if I can run on tired legs and have my technique perfect, then when I go on fresh legs, perfection is going to be there even at the end of the run, where that's where the injuries usually happen. As you fatigue, your posture goes, you start to slouch, you don't use your posterior chain. Now it's more of a compounding exercise that leads to injury over time. So that's kind of how I transition it over time. It's kind of separated, technique we focus on, and then we pull it over together. And it's the same with the weights workouts. We're just focusing mostly compound movements. And the auxiliaries are there, just, like on your arms, your shoulders, not so much, because you're going to get it on the compound, such as your bench press or like your bent over row or whatever it is. And then we start increasing and including like the arms, the shoulders, the auxiliaries as we get a little bit better with our recovery, because a lot of people fall short on the recovery. As we've got into this entrepreneurship space and, we're more dopamine dominant, we don't release as much oxytocin and serotonin because we just don't sit down and be and relax. I like to focus on that first, the HRV. And once we're able to get out of that, sympathetic dominant state and that dopamine dominant state, then we start increasing the frequency from there. Because most people just don't sleep enough. They really don't. Because that's what I was getting to. In this entrepreneurship space, we're like, okay, we don't have any time left. What can we tap into? It's usually sleep. And, the one thing that I have found has been the best biohack For most people, out of all the technology, then thousands of dollars that you could spend out there on stem cells and stuff is sleep.
100%. I thought you were going to say thousands of dollars you could spend on things to improve your sleep, because you could do that too.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
but you're right. Sleep is free. So, okay. What I was thinking of when, as you pulled that whole story together, was the idea of specificity as a hybrid athlete. In other words, we always try to separate these things into, okay, specificity to strength, specificity to endurance. And what you're saying is you're building them both together based on those metrics, including recovery being the big one. And when you start, just like any newbie, there's newbie gains to be had, but at the same time, you can't, overshoot, or it sounds like you're going to hit that fatigue wall or that overtraining wall and maybe backslide or get injured. So that's one thing that came to mind. When we talk about recovery, you said that's the first step, is to assess their ability to recover. We're in a very high wired world, sympathetic, dopamine dominant is what you said. You said we want to get their HRV to a better place. What's kind of a progression that occurs to do that early on?
So, some of this sounds a little bit woo woo and hippie, but a lot of the time I'm asking that person, where are you doing your cardio? Okay, it's indoors. Let's get outside a little bit. Make sure that we're including our hormones into this equation. So, vitamin D, as we know, is basically a hormone. It's like a precursor to testosterone. So, get out in the nature, get out in the sun. Again, we're releasing too much dopamine. So, don't take your headphones out. We're going to just listen to the sound of our footsteps, maybe the wind or whatever it is, but you're getting that sunlight as well at the same time. I will go as far as sometimes having that client, dependent on their gait, actually wear grounding shoes or grounding trainers. So there's a company, I'm not sponsored by this company by any means. They're called Bahi. They're out of the UK, and they have grounding trainers, and some of them are very, very comfortable. Like if I'm traveling and I want to travel light, I'm wearing those trainers because I don't want to take a load with me, and they're great to run in. Because we know if we're absorbing the negative ions from the earth, that's going to be anti-inflammatory as well, could possibly help with our ability to recover and HRV, etc. And some people are electrosensitive. If I hold a phone here and I've got my EMF reader here, then that number goes all the way up. Everybody at home can try this if they've got an EMF reader. But now, if I take my shoes and socks off and stand out on the grass, that number goes down, because that EMF is penetrating through me and not into me and kind of stabilizing itself there and causing inflammation. So the technology mixed with the ancestral wisdom side of things, there's that aspect first. And then I look at their ability to absorb the foods that they're consuming. So when they're eating food, because this is our fuel, this is going to give us our fuel to perform and our ability to recover. This is everything. But is the concentration of that food, number one, perfect? And are we absorbing that food? A lot of people will consume their meals while they're distracted. They could be driving, they could be scrolling, they could be in the middle of a meeting. So they're not allowing their body to understand and be cognizant of the fact that they're eating food and now they're full. Okay, it's much like you training in the gym and having a full-on conversation or a meeting with someone while you're doing bicep curls. You're not going to have that neuro pathway connection to adequately contract that muscle. It's the same when you're consuming food. You cannot be distracted and expect to absorb all the food. And this isn't just me talking, this is science. You can look at the scientific literature out there. There's a great book out there called The Slow Down Diet that people can read on this subject as well. So it's very important that you are cognizant, you haven't got distraction, you're putting your fork down between bites. Maybe you're thinking of your senses, your smell, your taste, the look of the food, the texture, etc. So now once you consume it, you're actually absorbing it. Because a lot of people, miss that passive digestion. So there's that aspect of things as well. And then, hydration is a big proportion of it, dependent on the climate that they're living in and how much that person sweats. So, you can't just consume water and then dilute yourself of all the essential minerals and electrolytes that the body is needed and the heart is needing just to relax and contract so you can adequately recover while you're actually moving as well. And then dependent on that size of that person, again, if they want to be a hybrid athlete, the person that they're training with, who is an endurance athlete, and that is it, you can't expect to consume the same amount of food or supplements as that person. You're going to require a lot more. It's basically like a rolling buffet when you're out there cycling. You're going to have a backpack. You cannot go out there with a couple of gel packs and a couple of bars and expect to reach the end of that ride. That muscle that you have requires so many more calories just to maintain itself, let alone continue to repair itself to build.
Yeah, we I was just talking to somebody earlier today about hunger during a bulking phase because it's one thing that surprises a lot of guys, right, when they start bulking for the first time. And it's just so resource intensive when you layer the cardio on top of that. I know what you mean, right? Because I've spoken to guys and they're like, yeah, 4,000 is the bare minimum calories on like a slow day, a non-training day, and then it goes up from there. So these are really good tips because I think a lot of folks jump right into I'll call it the well-known fundamentals of, okay, train, eat, sleep, this and that. And what you're saying is there's this other aspect of slowing down, of mindfulness, of physically interacting with what we're meant to, which is I'm looking at a warm, sunny day here in Connecticut. I feel like going out in my bare feet right now after talking to you, just going in the grass. And I'm going to look up those grounding trainers too. That's interesting. And then just hydration and food and how all of that impacts your ability to be successful here and become more parasympathetic dominant. I guess it would be the opposite, right, of sympathetic dominant. So, okay, so those are great tips. And then you mentioned technique, and you alluded to a few things like, and I know running is a big deal. We had Brad Kearns on the show, co-author of Born to Walk. Yeah. And he loves talking about how most people don't know how to run properly and they get injured, and footwear, have big cushion footwear and all that. Thinking about all the people you work with who are trying to improve their cardiovascular fitness and their hybrid athleticism, what would you say are like the big 2 or 3 technique, like low-hanging fruit for most people listening to the show?
Yeah, good question. So, knowing that this could potentially be a big part of your life and you don't want to wear down your cartilage, in your knees anytime soon, because now you're running, you're also squatting, you're leg pressing, your leg extending. That's a lot of wear and tear. And thankfully today, there's peptides that can actually help regrow cartilage, but we don't want to rely upon it, obviously. We want to just kind of prevent that need. So I always suggest, if you have the ability, that you run off-road whenever possible. If you're doing an ultramarathon, which is why I chose ultramarathon over conventional marathons, a lot of them are off-road. They can be unforgiving because of the inclines and the declines, but at least you're not dealing with that hard surface, the whole time that you're doing a lot of running. So I always suggest people to do off-road as much as possible, because you are actually going to strengthen the stabilizing muscles around your ankles, around your knees, around your hips, and of course your torso at the same time if you're on uneven surface. And it's going to be more forgiving on your knees. So that's the one. And again, if you don't have access to that, try to find a facility that has something that is a self-propelled treadmill, like a curve, like a Woodway curve or a Rogue, where you're actually pulling it yourself and you're not using the momentum of the treadmill, because that will really help take a lot of the strain from your knees and put it onto that posterior chain. So you're going to be able to get so many more miles out of your knees and more reps out of your knees if you do so. Okay, so that's one big aspect. The other thing when it comes to technique is, let's talk about cycling, for instance. Again, a lot of us not using the posterior chain, we're usually quad dominant, but there's a lot that you can do with the propel of that bike when you're using a posterior chain. But not only that, if you're a bigger person, you're probably not very well hydrodynamic. So you want to do whatever you can to get used to tucking yourself into a smaller position. Now, most people that are on the larger side, they're not flexible. So you have to really work on your flexibility and your mobility to be able to tuck yourself. Because like if you're on aero bars, like I had to have aero bars made for me to begin with, because I just couldn't bring my elbows in, from being too big. So I got used to just really closing that distance and using a lot of mobility techniques and doing yoga in order to do so. Because if you're out there doing like a 115-mile bike ride, over time, that adds up, especially when you've got the wind coming towards you. It really increases your calorie expenditure. So there was a ride that I used to do here in Boise that was just over 100 miles. And there's another one that I'd do that's 88 miles. But I'd measure the calories that I'm burning during that time so I could kind of estimate how much food that it's needed. If the wind is against me, as opposed to just no wind or behind me, the difference in calories is huge, absolutely massive. So if you're really focusing on being aerodynamic, you're not going to have as many calories, or you could just be hitting a wall and not have enough calories with you. And the same with hydration, of course. You know, you're going to go through a lot more hydration, water, and volume of fluid if you've got weather patterns that you're not kind of used to. So that's why it's very, very important. And then a big mistake that I notice when it comes to swimming, if you're even thinking of doing like a triathlon, is a lot of people will just get used to swimming in the pool, following that black line and not getting used to sighting, even if they are swimming in the pool. So I always tell people you need a sight like maybe every 4 to 6 strokes, because you'd be surprised if you do not have a black line to follow and you're used to following it, you'll be all over the place, you know, and you can lose so much time just going off track a little bit. And get used to sighting directly in the sun, because the chances are you will be, you know, face those challenges when you're out in the open waters, whether that's when you're breathing to one side, you're going to be facing the sun, or you're going to be facing the sun in front of you, because a lot of the time it's a circle. So at some point, and it's, you know, these triathlons are usually in the morning at sunrise, you're going to be facing the sun. So you've got to get used to all these kind of dynamics that you wouldn't necessarily prepare yourself for. So you have to think of the unexpected. When I start the swim with another 1,000 people, what are the chances of my goggles getting kicked off or punched off? You know, I've got to be prepared for these scenarios.
Interesting. Yeah. Things many of us don't think about, not to mention the current, I suspect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which can pull. I grew up in Florida, and some pretty strong currents there in the ocean. Before you know it, you're, you know, wondering where your family is. But no, that's great. So you gave us a technique for each of the 3 sports, and that raised the question to me, where does sprinting come into this? Because I know sprinting can be an important part of training when it comes to running, and they're not the same thing by any chance. There's a lot of differences. Just in general, what are your thoughts on sprinting for training itself, and as a specific, I guess, sport that you have to train for?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the bigger that person is, the more muscle that they're holding, the more they should actually focus on more sprint work. And there's several reasons why I say this. So when I first started getting into hybrid athleticism, anybody that's followed me knows that I'm a big volume trainer. I like to train with like 30, 40, 50 reps. You know, I like the challenge. I like the pain associated with it, because I feel that I've got more of a reward after dealing with that sacrifice. I've got more success over here. And I figured, okay, with all this repetition that I've done, especially on my legs and on my back, I'd be better prepared for like the cycle, the swim, the run. And it worked the opposite, because I found that I overtrained so easy, hitting all the volume in the gym and then hitting all the volume outside of the gym. So what I figured out over time by the mistakes is that I needed to bring down the volume. So my repetitions went from very high to very, very low. And I'm talking about like 8 to 10 repetitions. And then the frequency of my workouts went from like 5 to 6 times a week, the weight training workouts, down to like 4 days a week. Evidently the same with the endurance aspect. I'm thinking, okay, I've got to run for 8 miles. I've got to do this 100-mile bike ride or whatever it is. During the week, I'm going to focus on just long, and that's it, because that's what I've got to do when I compete in the Ironman. But again, my ability to recover was so bad that my performance in the gym was now useless. There was too much of a crossover. So then I started bringing down the volume and the duration and the miles of that endurance down into more VO2 max and sprints. So those sprints would be in the water. Let's say if I'm swimming usually for 45 minutes on a Thursday, now I'm bringing it down to 25 minutes, but with a lot more sprints in there. There's the warm up. I'm using more paddles, so I'm using more resistance and using sprints as my purpose to improve my endurance. And then the same with the runs. I'm finding like on the treadmill, I'm hitting more sprints, or I'm finding hills and I'm doing repeat sprints just to help propel my cardiovascular fitness without overtraining my physical aspect or causing central nervous system fatigue. Same with the cycle as well. I'm putting it up the gears as opposed to just keeping it in a low gear and spinning high. And I'm standing, I'm finding a hill. There's, where I live actually is the hill that I used to train on. I've just moved to this house, but right behind me is a hill that I used to do a lot of training on. I'm like, okay, I'm going to be standing for a lot of this training session, really working on those sprints as well. And what I found, again, over time, my HRV improved, my testosterone markers improved, because I found just with all this endurance and all this overtraining, my testosterone was coming down. I just wasn't feeling good. I wasn't feeling vibrant. I didn't have the strength. I felt fatigued. But athletes and entrepreneurs have this very strong mental strength and will just pursue and go, it's okay. I'm living in denial. I'll be fine. I've got this. When we're actually doing a lot more harm, and our ability to recover has obviously just gone through the hole. We don't acknowledge that, and then we get injured. Testosterone keeps coming down, and we're just digging ourselves into a hole. And a lot of endurance athletes that have signed up with me, we'll always do the blood work first. Usually their testosterone is in the tank, because a lot of athletes just want more, and they don't understand the ability to recover because they think more is better. So a lot of the time, if we've got beginners, we need to do more. A lot of the time, if we've got athletes, we have to do less.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm a huge fan of sprinting, which is why I asked, because when I finally got into it, it reminded me of back in my CrossFit days, how, you had the metabolic conditioning. Effectively, we were sprinting a lot, right, with your WODs. And I realized how that carried over very well into some of the endurance, just weekend stuff that I would do occasionally, where I had to run 5 miles, and I hadn't run 5 miles in, years, but I was capable of doing it, where I feel like it wouldn't have been possible without all that conditioning. So there, like you said, there's a crossover, and there's also a fatigue to work ratio that we have to be careful of. I've spoken to guys on the show that, used to put in a lot of miles, they get injured. And then now that they're older, they do just what you're saying. They actually have very few long runs during the week, maybe not even any for weeks at a time. And they're actually focused much more on this kind of very efficient mode of improving your fitness. So let me ask you this. Let's say someone doesn't care about competing in an event or triathlon or anything like that, and they just want peak cardiovascular fitness for its own sake. Could sprinting be the dominant form of cardiovascular conditioning?
If that person wants to be in hybrid athletes and hold a decent amount of muscle and continue to build muscle or maintain it, for sure. If they're focused on just endurance only, then it needs to be a part of it, but it doesn't have to be a bigger ratio of that proportion. So my 5 days a week or 4 to 5 days a week would be that. And then my 1 day a week would be the long and slow. So that is, okay, now I'm going out for my 100-mile bike ride because I've got to get used to time in the saddle. Or now I'm going to go for that 12-mile run because I just got to get used to being out there and fueling and understanding where is my fuel and hydration measurements are. So you understand that. So I would always do that like on a weekends, and then during a week, knowing I'm going to be busier anyway, I just keep it short and sweet to those sprints.
My name is Tony. I'm a strength lifter in my 40s, and I'd just like to say thank you to Phil and his Wits and Weights community for helping me learn more about nutrition and how to implement better ideas into my strength training. Phil has a very, very good understanding of macros and chemical compounds and hormones and all that, and he's continuously learning. And that's what I like about Phil. He's got a great sense of humor. We'll go back and forth. He's very relaxed, very easy to talk to. One of the greatest things about Phil, in my view, is that he practices what he preaches. He also works out with barbells. He trains heavy, not as heavy as me, but he trains heavy. He lifts. So he knows programs, he knows different variations. So if you talk with him about getting in better shape or eating better, he's probably going to give you some good advice. And I would strongly recommend you talk with him, and he'll help you out. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. And then I presume if you are going to compete in an event, even if it's not a big event, but something, you're going to have to change the ratio of your conditioning more toward the specific maybe distance as you get closer to the event, right? Just for the conditioning aspect, I suppose. And
Yeah.
then the nutrition has to change. Do you do, carb loading, or, do you start switching up the ratios of macros as you get closer to that event?
Yeah, so this is what I would. This is, and I did this for my second Ironman. Actually, I really tried to challenge myself to see how far I could go fasting before I actually bombed. And then when I knew where that level was roughly, that's when I would consume my calories, because I'd always try to find a way to make my training a lot harder than what I actually would on training on actually the event day, for instance. So as I mentioned before, I'd go and train legs and then go for my run. I'd train back and then go for my swim. So I'd make it harder. And the same thing from the nutrition, not from the hydration, but I would fast. So I'd go, I'd train in the morning fasted, but I would take supplements. I'd take essential amino acids to prevent that catabolism. I'd have glutamine as well to prevent a lot of that catabolism. But that was something that I kind of experimented with just to see if it would actually help on the day. And I found a balance between both. It wasn't necessarily just amino acids, and it wasn't necessarily a huge load. It was a proportion between, where I just found having some carb powder and protein powder would suffice. A lot of my nutrition, I guess, came from supplementation during these times. And it's not because I own a supplement company. It's just I found it so much easier to consume, especially for the endurance aspect, without it just taking a lot of blood into my stomach to digest it, where I feel nauseous or I feel fatigued. If I've got that blood in the muscles and in my brain, as opposed to in my stomach trying to digest, I just felt so much better for it. So I did rely on supplements a lot more, and I was able to condense a lot of calories into fluid. And my wife would make these protein balls as well that I'd have in my bag on the front of the bike, and I'd just be consuming them as I'm going along as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how impactful digestion and gut content is, and the timing of food, right? We talk about it even just in the lifting context with pre and post workouts, and everyone's a little bit different, right? Their response, like you said, you had to find where that limit was. Some people really thrive on, say, fasted strength training, and some people don't, or they just need something, like you said, dense, calorie dense, but not voluminous, right?
Yeah.
So what was I going to, this is good. You've mentioned some of the things you've tracked as well along the way as you're training. You mentioned blood work for testosterone. I'm sure other markers as well. You mentioned HRV. Sometimes we get into the weeds with this stuff and people shouldn't even care until they get to a certain point. But what are the big things that are important for just about anybody to track in this space?
Yeah, well, number one, just how you feel, because a lot of people,
Biofeedback.
endurance, kind of look at quantification too much. And they focus on their wattage and their heart rate, and they become consumed by it. Even if they feel okay, now all of a sudden they see their readings not looking okay. That now they've convinced themselves they're not. It's much like if I have clients measuring their sleep. If they measure their sleep and they look and they wake up in the morning, they feel strong, I'm going to hit my personal best today. And then they look at their numbers and go, oh my God, I didn't get that much sleep. Now all of a sudden they're not even considering that. I think you have to take it with a grain of salt and just go by your instincts to a certain degree. But the quantification that I really do like is what I said before, is heart rate variability along with sleep, just to ensure that you are getting good quality sleep there, because a lot of people are using devices before bed or they're watching TV, and now that artificial blue light is penetrating their retina, so they're not able to release the melatonin to keep them calm and allow them to sleep. And, again, it's coming down to adrenaline and dopamine, which can raise cortisol if that person's not sleeping. And cortisol is going to be catabolic. So always kind of measuring these things. The other thing that I always like to measure, as I mentioned, is, the heart rate. Making sure that we are pushing ourselves, but not to the limit where we feel that we just cannot recover. What is that heart rate after you've finished your workout session? How long is it taking to come back to baseline? So I kind of like to look at those numbers as well. And the other thing, intermittently, is always the blood work. Just see where the hormonal response is amongst all of this. How is their body ability to recover? Are they depleted in any vitamins? A lot of people they will take let's say they take a certain supplement. So let's take, we're talking now in the world of peptides. In endurance aspect, people are taking something called SLOOP, SLUP 332. I don't know if you or your listeners have heard of it, but a lot of people will take that and it depletes them of their vitamin B levels. And they're wondering, why am I feeling so fatigued? Well, number one, it's an exercise mimic. So you're actually utilizing more calories at rest. And number two, you're depleting yourself of B vitamins. So now you're wondering, oh, maybe I'm just overtrained. No, you're depleted. So I think it's very important that you have your blood work done as well, just to see if there are any depletions. And we kind of use that as our gamifications to improve. Now, there's a lot of other things that we can quantify out there as well. VO2 max, I like to do that. But I don't like to go that too far into the weeds, because I think people can take technology a little bit too far and rely on it a little bit too much. And if we look at some of the amazing triathletes from years ago, and I'm talking about like the 80s when they had no quantification, a lot of those still hold records today. So it goes to show that if they were able to do it on the trainers that they were wearing, on the heavier bikes that they were riding, and still hold records, then maybe the quantification can be taken a little too far.
Yeah, I totally agree, because we could confound the number with the results sometimes, even just in the physique world, where you're like, well, my numbers suggest I didn't put on much lean mass, but you know what? I'm happy with what I see in the mirror. It's like, okay, which do you want to care more about right now? I love data as well, but I also know the world of biohacking is so big now in the podcasting space, and it can go overboard where like that's all you're caring about. Something like VO2 max, I've had it tested once or twice, which that's a torturous test I don't like to do, but even that number is highly dependent on your condition that day, but also your weight and things like that are happening. We have to not read too much into it. And then as far as blood work, I'm really getting into that now, Kris. Actually, I'm kind of a latecomer probably, but and understanding that there are so many system level effects, right? Where there, if you look at vitamin B, like you mentioned, there could be 12 blood markers or mechanisms that are tied to vitamin B in some other way, and it's all kind of linked together. So you got to be careful, right, to not overread that. What was I going to ask? Oh, yeah. So the other thing that came to mind, you mentioned training a little bit. You mentioned the pre-fatigue and kind of mixing the modalities to make it harder on yourself so it's easier when you compete. Where do squats and lower body training come in? Because, I've met a lot of runners who never lifted before, and then they're shocked at how much better their running becomes, when their legs get a little stronger. So just kind of dig into that topic a little bit. Leg strength, squatting, recovery, all that.
Yeah, so what I used to do a lot of was like a lot of the isolation movements, your leg extensions, your hamstring curls, because I came from a bodybuilding background where you have to look at not only the function of the physique, but the aesthetics of the physique, the sculpting of the physique and certain muscles. So they would come from a lot of these isolation movements. But then as I started going down the rabbit hole of actually trying and testing, I found that the compounds is where it really helped, as opposed to just that, because he was able to, you think about it, the cycling is like a leg extension and a hamstring curl. So I found that I was able to continue to have the shape of the legs and the size of the legs just by that alone. So I think the compounds make a good cause for you to continue. Now that could be in the form of a squat. It could be in the form of a leg press. Whatever your physique or your structure allows is what you're going to do. So some people with very, very narrow hips and very tight Achilles tendons don't do well on squat. They start to bend forward because their tendons, they feel pain and tightness in their flexors because they're narrow hips. So maybe a squat isn't for them. It's going to be more of a leg press. That's going to be the movement. But, you kind of have to try before you buy. What I actually did myself based on my structure, and I've torn the tendons in my ankles like 7 times because I got very, very skinny ankles on a larger upper body and larger legs. So I would do my squats a lot of the time on a Bosu ball, as weird as that sounds, because I could really help strengthen the stability muscles around my tendons, around the ankles, being on a Bosu ball. Now that may be a forward lunge squat onto the Bosu ball, or a squat in a conventional way itself, with a bar on my back. I'm not saying everybody should do this, especially not unsupervised, but it worked for me because, touch wood, after doing that, and of course I do the rotations on my ankle in the morning, like 30 to the left, 30 to the right, and then plantar flexion, 30 of them. And touch wood, I've never had any problems with my ankle since then. But that's how it kind of helped me for my runs, because the last time I tore the tendons in my ankle was during a run, because my feet would advert. So that's kind of what helped me in that regards. Now, of course, if you are activating muscles by doing a squat, you've got now these new neural pathways that are reaching your legs. You're going to use those same neural pathways now when you're running, because a lot of us run unconsciously. Much like Brad said, a lot of people don't know how to run correctly. And they don't, because we're unconscious when you're doing it. But when you're squatting, you're more conscious of your balance, if you're pushing more through your left or your right. And you'll transition that into your run now. You'll be more conscious of that run, as long as you're not distracted. So, don't be on your phone. Maybe don't take the music out there. Just focus on your ability to activate each fiber and each muscle group accordingly.
Yeah. So you brought it back to that mindfulness you mentioned earlier, which I know I always tell people when I lift, every time I do a rep, I don't listen to anything. Like, oh, you don't listen to rock music to get yourself pumped up? I'm like, no, I want to focus on my form, because I know something's going on, and I want to hear my knees cracking too, So pay attention to this.
As we get older.
Exactly. You can find the problem spots that way. But so mindfulness is the name of the game. And definitely I like that proprioception, or whatever you want to call it. We like to throw out nerdy words, but mind muscle connection, being in tune with your body, with your form, with those movement patterns as a human. Some people are definitely more clumsy, right? And they kind of have to train more for that. And others are just naturally athletic. I guess as we wrap up here, there's probably a lot more we could have covered, but when you think of hybrid athleticism for the general population who wants to get into it, is there anything we didn't cover that we definitely should hit on?
Oh, good. Let me think now. I'd say more so than anything that, again, it all comes down on that person. But nutrition and hydration is everything, absolutely everything. And your ability to recover, obviously, sleep is going to be huge. But a lot of the time I find, especially with European athletes or clients, is that they think having a cup of tea or a coffee is hydrating, when it actually has a diuretic effect. And if I look at people's performance and it's down on a certain day or a certain week, it's usually coming down to their hydration. So knowing that your body is made up of around 70% fluid, just make sure that you get used to hydrating constantly, because when you're out there actually running or cycling, you're going to have to hydrate yourself a lot more. And if you're not hydrated, then your tendons, your ligaments, your muscles obviously become more brittle. You don't have the ability to promote synovial fluid to your joints. So everything is going to wear down a lot quicker, not just your ability to perform, but your ability to have longevity in this game. So, I'd say focus on that.
No, it's a good one. Yeah. Connective tissue, again, especially as we get older, we seem to be more sensitive to that. And especially if you got into this later, I know from personal experience, hydration is massive. All right, man. This has been awesome. I think we covered some really good things, a lot of practical tips from a guy who obviously has a ton of experience. So where do you want people to find you, Kris? And we'll throw those in the show notes so people can reach out.
Sure. If anybody has any questions whatsoever, they can reach out to me on Instagram. It's usually the best place to find me, and I respond to my DMs there as well. So it's Kris, Kris, Gethin, Gethin.
That's it. IG at Kris Gethin. I'll throw that in there. We'll connect everyone to you. Also check out Kris's podcast. A couple episodes ago, he talked about building muscle, losing fat, and mentioned some of the things he was discussing here with preserving muscle. So check out the show. Check out his IG. Kris, it's been a blast. Thank you so much for coming on your treadmill. It's inspired me to get out as soon as we're done and move around and get after it.
All right. I appreciate it, Philip. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.